I would like to thank the participants and the organizers for this conference for allowing me to participate in this mechanism. I have a lung condition that makes it challenging for me to get on airplanes, although I personally love to fly. Flying doesn't necessarily love me, and so from time to time I have to resort to videos and satellite in order to be able to participate in conferences like this across the ocean, and so I'm very grateful that for having this opportunity, and I thank you for all working with me so that I can find a way to participate. When I started to look at issues of business and peace about 12 years ago, there wasn't very much in the field. There was a wonderful book written by Jane Nelson on the business of peace. Virginia Hoffler shortly thereafter wrote a book under the sponsorship of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace called A Private Role for the Public Role for the Private Sector. But there really wasn't very much that was addressing issues of business and peace. And it's important to emphasize the difference of business and peace as opposed to economics or trade and peace. Clearly those are related kinds of topics, but the economics and the trade and peace, that debate, that connection has been argued about and has been fleshed out and theorized about for hundreds of years. There's nothing particularly new about the idea, although there is always evolving research of how to connect economics and trade and peace. But the idea of business and peace, the particular business actors and what they do in order to foster peace, is relatively new. You didn't find it, as I said, more than about 10 to 12 years ago. And now it's become a fairly flourishing, albeit still small, kind of a discussion in academic circles and in NGO circles and even in some government agencies and policymakers as well. And so one of the things that I would like to do is to give you a little bit of background of the academic literature and how it has come to frame issues of business and peace. Now, as a preliminary issue, as I talk about this connection, and in many ways my contributions to building this academic literature, it may be important to remember that my main job, the source of where I start my research, is that I am a business ethicist. And so with that in mind, it may be helpful to recount just a little bit of how I came to look at this particular connection and then build out from there of some conceptual connections that has been argued by myself and by others of the connection between business and peace. I was writing a book in late 1999, 2000 for Oxford University Press that was talking about how to build ethical corporate cultures. And as I was finishing that book, literally as I was finishing that book, I happened to be doing some auxiliary reading for my own enjoyment from the peace studies literature, which I've always just liked to read because I think it's interesting stuff. And in that literature, I came across some studies by anthropologists who were looking at characteristics and attributes of relatively nonviolent societies. And as I looked at those attributes of relatively nonviolent societies, some of that work done by David Fabro and Raymond Kelly, I noticed that they were very, very similar to the attributes and the characteristics that I was arguing for in terms of building ethical business culture. And for me, that was the aha moment. I wonder, I thought, if there is a connection between not just any business behavior, but ethical business behavior, and whether by practicing ethical business behavior, an unexpected result may occur, and that is a contribution actually to sustainable peace itself. And so that began my journey of looking at the connections between business and peace. And others have joined me along the way. According to a recent study by the Aspen Institute, there are some 140 scholars that have written about this topic of business and peace. And so it has become this new sort of small field, but I think a very important field, and I think one that holds great potential for the creation of more peaceful societies and the reduction of violence. Now, before I get into the particular contributions that I think that I would offer that business could make toward peace, it is worth of stepping back for a second and asking whether businesses are the right institutions to be talking about in the first place. I mean, after all, many people have noted of the problematic impact businesses can have. Businesses were the agents, the instruments of colonialism. Businesses frequently engage in sweatshop labor practices, of abuse of local populations, of insensitivity to cultural practices, of, of spoiling the environment. Are those the kinds of businesses we think would actually contribute to peace? And I think the answer is probably no. But there are other kinds of businesses that can make, I think, important contributions to peace. And I would call those ethical businesses. Now, as soon as those words are out of my mouth, I know that many people are beginning to wince of, oh my goodness, now we're talking about ethical business behavior. Whose ethics? Whose virtues? How do we know what constitutes ethical business behavior? Is it followers of Aristotle or Kant or Rawls or a particular religion? Or how do we know what ethical business practices constitute themselves of? And my response is, well, let's start with peace. If we're able to identify that there are certain attributes of relatively peaceful societies, then maybe we can look at ethical business behavior as those kinds of behaviors that correlate with those attributes. And as it turns out, and you'll hear more about here in a few minutes, those attributes, as I already suggested, map really well with attributes of nonviolent societies. And they map well with ethical business practices so that there's not that necessarily many things that are controversial about putting those two things together. And in doing so in that way, one removes the controversial starting off point of exactly, well, whose ethics should we follow? The ethics that seem to be demanded by peace. And let's just leave it at that, at least for now. So that's one response. But there's another response or another way of conceiving of what business can do, and perhaps a way or two where we don't necessarily get the greatest bang for our buck in pursuing the argument. One is that businesses do have the ability to reach across borders to get people who otherwise might be quarreling or fighting to work together on a common project, even if that project is mainly about making money. There was an organization called Futureways in Northern Ireland a few years ago that intentionally hired half Catholics and half Protestants to have them work together in the same workforce rather than throwing sticks and stones and bullets and things like that on the streets. And so business has the opportunity to reach across borders to get people to work together who otherwise might not work together. Businesses also create jobs, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, the creation of jobs and the alleviation of unemployment can have great contributions to nonviolence. And so businesses that do their work in a certain way, ways that I'm going to describe, could make a good contribution. The ones that are respectful, that build economic development, that are sensitive to cultural practices, and basically are not corrupt institutions themselves. And so a certain segment of businesses might contribute to peace. Some might do it explicitly. They may say that we see these connections and we want to pursue peace in our business. Those may be more the social entrepreneurial kinds of business, but there may be more of those than what we might think. But even if those aren't all the businesses, there are others that, again, at least according to my theory and my framing, if they are practicing good, solid, ethical business practices, they are, whether they know it or not, making good contributions to peaceful environments and societies. And so those kinds of businesses, the businesses that build trust, those kinds of businesses are the ones that can make a contribution to peace. If they're more aware of the contributions that they are making by being ethical, so much for the better. Then they may be even more mindful of what it is that they are doing and will practice their ethics more seriously and consistently. But simply being ethical business practitioners may have an important contribution to peace. That's me as the ethicist talking anyway. Now let me say one more final thing before giving you the contributions to peace. I was at a conference on a panel, actually, at the University of Notre Dame about 7 or 8 years ago. And one of the panelists, who was an economist, was very challenging of this notion of business contributing to peace. And one of her points was that we don't want businesses to get in the midst of trying to settle long-standing bitter disputes. What the heck do they know? What does businesses know about diplomacy? How are they going to solve religious and ethnic quarrels? And so her point was that there are people who do those things. They're called diplomats. And the diplomats should be able to do their work without interference from businesses. And I think there's a point there. I think that there is a point that while businesses still may make contributions in zones of conflict, but there are points, I think, in which we want to make sure that we're not telling businesses to resolve all the violence in the world, to create world peace, to be the agent of an individual or resolving an individual conflict. That may be there, it may not be there. But what is more likely to be a contribution is a business practice that is in the midst of building a kind of economy, building a social structure that is less likely to have to resort to violence or is building itself out away from violence. And so I'm not sure if I want businesses to be considered as dispute resolvers or diplomats as opposed to being peace builders themselves. And that's the basic framework of my work and many others who are working in this business and peace field. So, with all those preliminaries aside, what are the three contributions that I have argued and others seem to be adopting quite a bit of the way that businesses can contribute to peace? There are three. I have argued these individually and with a co-author, Cindy Scapani, and again, they've been picked up by many others as a basic starting framework of how to think about the way businesses can build peace. One is the one that's the most natural one, creating jobs, building economic development. I mean, when we talk about economics and trade, the idea is that someone is going to actually provide a job. Well, who does that? It's the businesses who are the ones that create the jobs. And so businesses doing what businesses do best, of being profitable, of creating jobs, of reducing unemployment, make an important contribution. There are studies that have been done by both the United Nations and the World Bank and others as well that show that there is a clear correlation between violence and poverty. Some of the reasons for that may be because in poverty-stricken situations, the quest for material resources may be so extreme that one has to resort to violence in order to be able to feed themselves and their family. Another argument is that if there is a lot of unemployment, those people who are unemployed are susceptible to the overtures of charismatic individuals with funds for protest or for violence. So there are connections between poverty and violence. And by building or creating more jobs, businesses are doing something that is particularly constructive. That's particularly true if they can do it outside of the extractive industries. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I think that there is an important role and important things that extractive companies can do in order to build peace. But as Paul Collier notes, that one of the best predictors for a civil war is if the main export product of a country is an undifferentiated commodity. And so if businesses can diversify the economy to create more value added other than bringing things out of the earth, they are probably contributing to an economic system that is going to be moving the needle away from violence and toward peace. In addition to these very straightforward job building, when a company, particularly a multinational company, goes to an emerging market, perhaps conflict sensitive area, they bring with it both technology and management know-how. Technology that can diversify the economy, and also business know-how of how to run a business well, which can have spillover effects in the country so that other businesses are also run well as they see a business in their midst and the practices that they engage. So the first one is fairly straightforward, businesses fostering economic development. The second one is a rule of law kind of approach. Though to the extent that countries have more rule of law practices, they tend to resort to violence less. An obvious one is a dispute resolution mechanism, whether it's a judiciary or an arbitration system or something like that, By definition, if you've got a dispute resolution mechanism in your country, then it is more likely that you are going to resort to that than violence. If you don't have one there, you have fewer choices of how to resolve a dispute. And so dispute resolution forums can be very important, and corporations can do something in order to contribute that by recognizing them, by supporting government efforts in order to build them. Those are all things that companies can do in order to support peace. A second set of issues are protection of contract and property rights. That's how you're going to get businesses to come into a country in order to build, particularly if you're going to be doing it in a long-standing way. Companies have to be able to protect their property and contract rights. But perhaps the most interesting one, at least from my vantage point, is the connection between corruption and violence. I don't do a lot of empirical research, but I did one study that showed that there was, along with Cindy Scapani, that showed that there was an exact correlation between corruption and violence. By using Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and also using the Heidelberg Institute's COSMO Index of how countries resolve conflicts by violence or not, we found that those countries that are the most corrupt are the most likely to resolve disputes by violence, 60% of the time. Those countries that are the least corrupt are the least likely to resort to violence to resolve disputes, 14% of the time. And what's in between those quartiles of the most corrupt and the least corrupt fall naturally in sequence with that. Well, there's something that actually business can do, something fairly concrete. To the extent that businesses can have policies against bribery to give their employees backbone to be able to stand up and say, I can't pay you a bribe, even if I would like to. I mean, they do something to move the way that business is conducted, that social relations are conducted, that government is even conducted, away from corruption that is connected to violence. And so there's a concrete way that businesses can make a contribution to peace. Then the third way is actually, as an ethicist, probably my favorite, although it's a little bit more awkwardly phrased. And that is what I call a sense of community. Businesses having a sense of community in two ways. One is an external dimension and the other is an internal dimension. The external dimension is corporate citizenship, corporate social responsibility, and I think we have a pretty good sense of what those things look like. Those are things like being environmentally sensitive and not dumping waste on a disfavored ethnic group. It is about respecting human rights. It is about being sensitive to local cultural and religious norms. I mean, it's all the things that go with being a good neighbor, a good citizen when you're doing business in a country. And those have been recognized. In fact, the United States Secretary of State has something called the Award for Corporate Excellence that recognizes companies that do such good citizenship and economic development work that they build better diplomatic relations between that host country and the United States. And so the notion of corporate citizenship and economic development tied into diplomacy is not very new, and I think that we pretty well understand that. The more interesting one to me is the internal dimension. That is how corporations are themselves structured, how they treat their employees, their workers. What do those kinds of relationships look like? And the example that I would like to start off with is that there is a long-standing management theory, management practice that is along the lines of quality management that says that in order to produce a quality product, that workers up and down the production line must speak up if they see a product defect. Speaking up is a dimension of self-governance. Speaking up is a dimension of democracy and voice. And there's all kinds of studies that show connections between self-governance and democracy and peace. Now, I'm not suggesting that corporations become their own democracies, but I am saying that if people have the opportunity to speak up, they will, again, this is a management tool, they will produce better products that are profitable. But from a social standpoint, they will also experience the sense of self-governance and democracy that could have spillover effects in the society in which they live. And so a good, solid business practice can have dimensions that correlate with peace and democracy as well. Or there are other indicators as well, or other ways to structure the organization. For instance, there are clear correlations that show connections between gender equity and nonviolence. The more women have equal opportunity, the less they are harassed, the more likely it is for that society to be peaceful. There again is something that companies can do. And maybe companies are operating in an environment where women simply aren't allowed to be in the workforce. Well, even if that's the case, or if it's only marginal of the kind of work that they can do, still to the extent that you can protect them, not make them harassed, you're doing something that is better. Or, while it may be true that some countries don't accept women, countries and cultures aren't monolithic. Maybe 30% of the people in that country would accept a woman in a position of authority. And so there's a way to work with them that empowers women, that again leads to the kinds of support and contributions to peace that are beneficial. Human rights are another example of that as well. So, and the point is how business structure itself, how they structure themselves, can make an important modeling dimension, have important spillover effects, and as well as being good, solid, ethical business practices. So those are the three contributions that I, Cindy Scapani, and others as well have argued of three ways that businesses can make concrete contributions to peace. Now, a caveat here. Cindy and I, in particular, are both lawyers, and we have said that all we have done at this point is to create what we call in the U.S. a prima facie case. That is a case of first impression. That is a case that is plausible, that makes sense. We have not proven the connection of business and peace beyond a reasonable doubt. We haven't even proved it with a preponderance of the evidence, two other legal standards, at least in the U.S. But we have made a case that suggests that there's something there. There does seem to be a contribution that could be made. There does seem to be something beneficial that business can do in order to foster peace. And so it's plausible. It's a prima facie case. And I want to challenge everyone here, and scholars and NGO leaders and government policy makers and business people and economists all over the world to refine this argument. I will be the first one to cheer if I find out my argument isn't quite right and that there's a better way to do it, because the important part is how we contribute to peace, not who has the perfect answer. And so I hope that people will take the opportunity to think about this conceptual model that we have and think of ways to test it empirically, to modify it, to refine it, to make it better. That's what we need right now. We have conceptual models that are out there. We have case studies that show that there are important ways that business can contribute to peace. But we need to be much more systematic, and we need to be much deeper. Much deeper in our empirical and data-based research in order to find ways that this is supportive. And if there's one other thing that I really think that we need to do, is that we have to be multisectoral. This argument or this modeling of what business can do to contribute to peace can't come simply from the academics. It can't come simply from the government or even business or the NGOs. In fact, the very first conference that I ever ran when I was a professor at the University of Michigan, the first conference that I did on business and peace, we had people from all different sectors. And after the conference, we had a very interesting response from all of them, that this idea of what business can do to contribute to peace is a great idea, but it's really more the work of the other two sectors. NGOs said that about business and government. Business said that about government and NGOs. Government said about business and NGOs. And it just went around in a circle. That everybody thought it was a great idea, but it was really more the other two sectors that were the most responsible. And the fact of the matter, it's got to take all the sectors. Business has to find a way to have a business case for doing peace. Now, some businesses do get into business for non-economic reasons. In fact, there's a lot more than one might suspect on that. But they still have to find a way to at least break even and make at least a small profit, if not a big profit. But they also have to be supported by governmental policies that make themselves more prone to take these kinds of risks. And they need to be partnering and learning more about the places where they are going and doing work with the NGO community. This truly is an opportunity for multi-sectoral dialogue of how to harness the power that business has in order to make a substantial contribution to peace. One very, very high-ranking former U.S. government official, a former White House official, said in private conversation to me a few months ago, this has been under our eyes for hundreds of years. How can we not have noticed this? It's been right there in front of us, but we've never actually looked at what business can do. Exactly. It's right there. It's a powerful social institution in the world, and there's something that it can do in order to contribute to peace. The academic literature is now there, informing and getting richer, but it really needs to go to another level, and I hope conferences like this and research that goes on beyond this, and conversations and partnerships and government policy hearings, I hope that these are all the next step that we take in order to make a great contribution of business to peace. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you have a great conference.